Hello, hello. In Saturday's lecture, we weren't quite able to finish the demonstration project and get to the code part of it. So this video is to follow up on that discussion and show you in the code what we can do to integrate our database into our application. Just a reminder that for my demonstration, I'm going to use SQLAlchemy. And SQLAlchemy is not the only way to interact with the database with Python. So make sure to also take a look at Professor Derazinski's videos that show a different way that you can interact with your application and your database. For SQLAlchemy, I'm going to show you two ways today with this demonstration project. I'm going to show you how I can use SQLAlchemy to create my database tables and populate them with data. Or if you want to choose a different way to create your database tables and populate it with data, then I'm going to show you another way that you can use SQLAlchemy after the fact for just writing queries against your database and getting information out of it. Let's take a look at where we are headed. And this is what I showed previously, but I just wanted to give you a quick refresher for this video. So today we are going to add in our database. And this is what my database is going to look like. I have three tables, one for teams, one for games, and then in the middle, connecting those two together, I have scores. So each team will have a score for every game that they play, and each game will have two scores, one for the home team and one for the away team. So when we run our application, we're going to start at the app entry point. We will then pass it off to the main controller and let the main controller orchestrate everything. The main controller will go to our team model, which will read in the teams from our data file and store that into the database. We'll then let the main controller go to the game model, and the game model will know how to read in games and scores from that second data file. We'll store those in our database. We will then come back to the team model, which will run a query against our database to get the teams and the points per game for each team calculated and ranked from highest to lowest. And then we will pass that on to our view that will display that for our users. On Saturday, I directed you to a specific page on the SQLAlchemy website called the ORM Quick Start. And in here, it gives a really good example walking through a use case for users and for addresses of building out some models that will build tables and running code that will add data into the database as well as modify and remove data from the database. So this is where I started with this example. And I've gone ahead and made some changes to our code because I didn't want to make you watch me just type a lot. But this is where I started for making my modifications, and I'll show you what I modified. So in our models folder, I've added a new model for a base model. And in my base model, all I've done is defined a class called base. And it inherits from declarative base, which is something that comes from SQLAlchemy. And inside of this base class, we really don't need anything specifically. We're going to use this class to build some other classes that will inherit this class. And by doing that, this will give us a single place that we can point SQLAlchemy to go find all of the metadata for our different tables that we want to build and build those out. Now, optionally in this base class, you can go ahead and define some columns in here for your tables, and anything defined in the base class will be automatically added to any of the classes that inherit this base class. So you might remember that from the inheritance that we talked about with object-oriented programming. Notice we're using classes again here, so this is all object-oriented. In my team model, I have gone ahead and removed my old team class. You can see all the different fields here that we were capturing for the teams, and then we also had some methods down here that did some of the calculations for us. Now, these methods that do some of the calculating, that add the games, calculate the points per games, we're going to use a query to do this going forward. So I'm going to remove this and not necessarily rewrite it right now, but we'll come back and rewrite that. Here at the top is my new team class. And you'll notice that I have inherited my base model.base class. So I've gotten access to that by importing the base model from my models package. And I inherit that from my team class. Now what you see inside here looks a little bit different than what we dealt with when we were doing our regular object-oriented programming. And again, you can get an example from the SQLAlchemy ORM webpage. But I'll kind of describe to you what I've done here. You'll see the first thing I did was I gave it a table name of team. And this is a variable that SQLAlchemy will look for specifically. And this just lets SQLAlchemy know what to name our table in our database. You'll see here I've defined some properties for our class. And these are going to be the columns in our database tables. So I have one for ID, one for the school, for mascot, abbreviation, conference color, and alternate color. Scores down here is something different, and I'll get to relationships in a bit. But you'll notice in these top properties, we have a colon and a mapped, and then something inside of mapped. And this looks a little bit odd. This is a bit strange from what we're used to. Typically, we have a variable and we assign it some value with the equal sign. But what we're doing here is we're giving SQLAlchemy a type for each one of these columns. Okay, so ID is going to be an integer type. School will be a string. Mascot is going to be an optional string. So it could have a value in it or it might not. And the same for these others. They're all optional strings. Now in SQLAlchemy, when we're defining these, we can leave it with just the type, or we can also use equaled map column and give it some extra information about that column. Here specifically in the team model, I've told it that the ID column is going to be my primary key for this table. You'll recognize down here at the bottom, we also have a method called repr, R-E-P-R, with double underscores on both sides. This stands for representation. And here, this is basically the same as what we were doing before with the str function to print a string. So I have copied what I used to have in my str function for this and put it into this new repr function. And so this is what will get printed out now if we try to print the objects for this class. Again, scores. This is going to be a relationship to our scores table, but I'll come back and talk about this in a little bit after we get to the scores table. I'll show you the game model. It looks very similar. So I have my ID again. Again, I've told it that this is my primary key. I have some other fields here that are mapped, and I have my REPR method. I've created another model in my models package, and this one I called score model. We didn't have this before when we were in our last iteration of this code. But now that I'm going to have a database table for it, I decided I would go ahead and create a score model. So inside my score model, I have a class for scores. Again, all of these inherit from that base class that we defined in our base model. I told it that I want my table name to be score, and I have my columns defined down here. You'll notice my top two are my game ID and my team ID. Those are both going to be integers. And not only are these going to make up my primary key, so I have primary key on both of those, but these are also both foreign keys to other tables. So here in my mapped column function, I can tell it that these are a foreign key. And in particular, game ID goes to the game table and the ID column. My team ID goes to the team table and the ID column. For team side, I have this mapped as just a string, and this is going to be either home or away when I put my data in. And then for my points, I have as an optional integer. Now you'll notice here I have team and game, and these are not actually going to be columns in my table because these are relationships, and I kind of referred to this earlier in the team and the game models, so I'll go ahead and talk about it here now. So team is going to be a variable for objects in this class, and it is going to point to team objects. And by saying equal relationship, I am telling SQLAlchemy that this is going to be a relationship to an object in a different class, specifically my team class. Okay, and this back populates a variable that I have over in my team class called scores. And if I go look at my team model, you'll see here I have the variable scores, which just maps it back the other way. All right, it back populates that team variable that we just looked at through a relationship. And this one is going to not only point to a score, but it's going to point to a list of scores. Okay? Because SQLAlchemy is pretty smart and it knows about our foreign keys up here, it knows how to make these relationships between these two. So not only do I have a relationship going to my team table, but I also have one going to my game table. And it looks very similar here. So now that we've set up our database tables, let's go ahead and look at creating our database and getting those tables created. So I've come back now to my base model module, and in here I'm going to create a function that will allow me to create that database. I'm going to call this function create database. And in here we're going to need a few things. We're going to need an engine to our database, and you can think of the database engine as this is what connects us to the database, and this is what's going to actually go run and execute our queries against the database. So let's create an engine, and let's call this engine, and we will say I'm using this create function from SQLAlchemy. And if you're wondering where I get all of these import statements from, I'm grabbing those from that ORM example that's on the SQLAlchemy website. So I'm going to use this create engine function. And in here we can pass it where our database is going to be. And it starts out with a little connection string that tells us what type of database this is. So this is a SQLite database. And you can leave it like this for an in-memory database, but here we want to actually write out a database file. And so I'm going to write this out to my models folder, and I'm going to call this cache.SQLite because this is going to be my caching database. All right. Now, to build our tables, we can use a function that comes from the declarative base class, but we're going to call it on our base class. And since our base class inherits our declarative base, it also gets all of the methods that come with that. So here we will call our base class dot, and this is get the attribute metadata, and then we're going to call a function called create all. And we pass into this function the engine that we just created. And again, this code here that I'm typing out, I'm getting from the ORM example that was on their website. Now, later on in the code, I'm going to need access to this engine to be able to run any queries. So what I'd like to do here is I'd like to make this engine variable available to my other models who are going to need to come grab it. And so to do that, I'm going to make this engine variable be a global variable in this base model. And so to do that, I can define it out here in my global scope, and I'll just set it equal to none at the beginning because we don't have an engine yet until we call this function. All right, so if I define it outside of any class and any function, it defines it in the global scope of this file. And any variable that's created inside of a function or a class is only inside of the scope of that function or class. So right now, even though I have two variables, both called engine, these are two separate variables. One of these is global, and this one gets defined just inside of this function. But what I can do to reference this global variable is I can use something in Python where I type out global engine. And this now pulls in that global variable so that I can use it inside of my functions. All right. So when we call this function create database, we'll create an engine. We'll set, using this function here, we'll set this we'll assign it to this global variable engine, and then we will go ahead and use that engine to create all of our tables. And it's doing this by going through the base class and getting to its metadata, which includes all of these other tables that we defined. All right. So I'm going to save this class, and now let's go open up our main controller, because our main controller, remember, is what orchestrates and controls all of this. So before we read in any of the team's data, we know we're going to have to go create that database. So let's add a line here to create our database if it doesn't exist. Sometimes when we run this, that database will already exist. But it's still okay to go ahead and run these functions, run this function so that we get this engine variable that we can use later. And if the tables are already created, then this won't do anything. So we are going to need to call that function from our main controller. So to be able to get access to that function in the base model, I need to make sure that I import my base model. So from my models, I'm going to import base model, and then I can use base model dot create database function, which we'll go call that function. Okay, so I'm going to put a breakpoint here because I know my other code is not going to run right now. We haven't updated it yet. So I'm going to put a breakpoint there, so we just run to this point right here where we go create that database. And let's run this and see if it works. So I'm going to open up my app.py file. Remember, this is my application entry point, and I'm going to hit debug from this file. Now you'll notice that my debugger made it all the way to my breakpoint without throwing any errors, which is good. Let's go ahead and stop it, and let's take a look at our files. You'll notice here that we have a new file inside of our models package called cache.SQLite. This is the database that we told it to create. I'm using some extensions here. I'm using this SQLite and SQLite Viewer extensions. So the SQLite Viewer extension is going to allow us to click on this database in Visual Studio and see our tables and data that are in there. So we have a team table with all of the columns that we defined. We have a game table, and we have a score table. None of these tables have any data in them yet, but that's okay. That's the next step, is we need to get our data added into these tables. So let's come back to our main controller, and let's look at what our next step is, which is to create the team's data. So I'm going to move my breakpoint down, and let's focus on now reading in this team's data. So I'm going to go to my team model. I'm going to go ahead and delete all of this old code now that we don't need it anymore. And I'm going to focus on my function that reads in this team's data. So we are still going to need to open the file and read that in. So I'll leave that code there. But now this code below, where we created a dictionary for these teams and we looped through everything and created these team objects, we're gonna modify this part, because we aren't keeping them in a dictionary anymore. We're keeping these in our database. We're still going to need to loop through that team's data. And we'll still be creating team objects from it. But now we're going to be using, instead of just passing in team data straight like we were before, we're going to need to pass it all of these fields that we have defined in our team class now. So for now, I'm just going to put pass in there, and we'll come back to this. And I'm no longer going to return this to my main controller, because instead of passing that team data back to my main controller, I'm just going to put it straight into the database. So we won't return anything from this function, but we'll call it, and we'll right here what we want to do as we loop through this data is we want to put it into the database table. So to do this, I need to have what's called a session. And a session in a database allows us to run some actions against that database, such as adding records in, or making updates, or making deletes. And then it allows us to commit all of those changes at once. Or if something happens in the middle there and we decide that we don't want to do that, we can roll back the whole session and it will be like nothing happened. So to create a session in SQLAlchemy, and we're doing, again, I'm going to use some code that I'm borrowing from the example that they provided in their ORM quick start example. But we will create a session, and so I'll say with session, and inside of this session object that I'm creating, this is this class, and I'm going to create a session object. I need to pass it what my engine is. And remember, our engine we created in our base model when we created this. And so it's my base model.engine. So inside of here, inside of my team model, I need to make sure that I've imported my base model, which I have. And so now I can say base model.engine. And that gets my engine from the base model. I'll call this session. And by using this with notation, it's going to go ahead and open and close our session for us. Very similar to how we're doing it up here with our data file. This with opens our data file, and then when we unindent from the with, it goes ahead and closes that data file for us. We're doing a similar thing with our session here, so we're going to open our session using this with, and then when we unindent or get done with this function, it's going to go ahead and close that session for us. So now that we have that session set up, we're going to loop through all the team data, and now we need to create some team objects and add this to our session so that we can commit those. So inside my for loop, I'll get this session object. I'll tell it that I want to add something. And I'll tell it that I want to add a team object. Remember, SQLAlchemy acts as an ORM, an object relational mapping. And so by creating these objects from these classes, SQLAlchemy will know how to go put those into our database for us. So inside of team, I need to go ahead and give it the values. So my ID is going to be coming from my team data, and it's called ID. And I'll go ahead and fill out the rest here. So I've put all of my values in to the team, and we have a session open. We have created a team model or a team object here for each item that was in our team's data file that we read in. And now that we have all of those queued up into our session, we can choose to either commit our session or we can roll it back. Roll it back means that we won't apply it to the database. But we want to now commit this to the database to get these added in. So outside of my for loop, because I don't want to commit every time I run, I'm just going to commit once. I'm going to say session.commit. All right, and this will write this data to the database. So I'm going to save this file. I'm going to save my main controller and come back out to my app entry point, and let's run it from here and see if it will work. All right, so we made it to our breakpoint. We made it past that function. We didn't get any errors, so that's a good sign. And let's go look at our database. So if I open up this cache.SQLite database now, then you will see that it has in my teams table, it has gone ahead and populated all of that team's data. Now I do want to mention something else with the SQLite, or with this SQLAlchemy. There's one more function that field that I didn't put on here with my engine that we could have optionally chose to put on, and that's called echo. And if we set echo to true here, then what it'll actually do when it runs this code is it will print out the commands that it sends to the database. So I can show you that. I'm going to go ahead and delete my database as it is right now, because we have code to, I'm going to have to stop my debugger before I can delete it. We have code now that can create that database and add that team data in. So it's okay if I delete my database as it is. And then let's rerun this from the main entry point and watch my screen here as it prints out the commands that it's running on the database. So you'll see here when it came in to create our tables, here is the code, the SQL code that gets sent to the database to create each of those tables. And then we come in to insert records into team. And this is all the data that it sends in with that. So you can see by adding, just by adding echo equals true when I create my engine, I can now get some insight into what SQLAlchemy is doing at the database level. So now that we have our database here and we have some data in it, let's see what happens when we run our application again. You'll notice that we hit an error here on our commit when we tried to add these teams again. And this is a unique constraint error on team.id. Now, if you remember, team.id is our primary key in our database table. And so a unique constraint error is telling us that it's trying to add in another record to team, but the primary key is not unique. And remember that our primary keys have to be unique. So what happened was we had all of our team data in there, and we came in to rewrite all that team data, and it can't add in a new team for a team that already exists in there. So let's figure out some code to work around that. And there are a number of ways that you could go about doing this, but let's just say that before we go and add these teams in here, let's figure out what all teams are already inside of our table, and then we can add a conditional inside of our loop here so that if we get a team in our team data that already exists in the database, then we can skip over adding that to our session. All right. Like I said, there are a number of ways to do this, but I want to use this as an opportunity to show you how to query and get objects back from the database using SQLAlchemy. So let's add a section here to find teams already in the database. And to be able to query this from the data or from the database, we're going to need to do this inside of our session because we're going to have to use the session with the engine to be able to get to be able to run those queries in the database. So let's create a variable. I'm going to call it existing teams. Let's call it existing team objects. And to query this using SQLAlchemy, we can use our session object and we can call a function called query. And in query, we can pass what we want to get out of the database. So we will pass it the class that points to the type of objects that we want to get out. So in this case, we're going to point it to team because we want to get the team objects. When you query this, you can get back the first record that comes back, or you can also get all of the records that come back. So let's go ahead and get all of the records. And if we run this, I'm going to go ahead and put a breakpoint right there, and let's run this and see what happens. See what gets put into our variable. So I'm going to clear out all my existing watches and then add a watch on the existing team objects. And if I drop this down, you can see that we have a whole bunch of team objects. All right, so this is a list of team objects that came out of the database, thanks to SQLAlchemy. So what we need to do before we decide if we need to add a new record to the database or not is we need to look at that primary key, which is the ID, and we can see if it already exists in our database or not. So let's take this list of objects and let's get a list of all of their IDs so we have something to check our new ID against. So I'll create a new variable called existing teams IDs. We'll make this into an empty list, and then let's loop over our team's objects and pull out their IDs. So I'm going to say for team, for each team in the existing teams objects. Let's add that ID to the existing teams IDs. So we'll take that list and we will append this variable now is what we're getting out of our for loop. So we'll do team.id because team is an object coming out of this list. So to get to that property in there, we can just say .id. All right. So let's run this again and let's see what is in our existing teams IDs variable. So if I add this to my watch, now we can see here are all the IDs that came from my team objects. All right, so all we need to do now is when we're looping through our new data, remember this team's data is what came out of our JSON file. So as we loop through this new data, we need to check and make sure that it's not already in the database before we add it. So let's add a conditional for if, and the ID is going to come from team data ID. So if team data ID not in our existing teams ID list, then we will add it to the session. If it is in the list, we don't have an else condition, so we just skip over adding it and continue on our for loop until we get done with our for loop and then come into this commit. Okay? So I'm going to stop my debugger and let's test this out. And so to do this, let's go ahead and look at our database and let's find a team that's already in here. So maybe the Auburn Tigers right here have an ID of 2. So I'm going to delete those out. Delete out that one that has an ID of 2. And to do this, I'm going to be using the SQLite add-on extension in Visual Studio. And so with that, I can come up to my command palette under View, and I can run a SQLite quick query. And I'm going to run it on my models/cache.SQLite database. So this is the database I want to run it on. And then it's going to ask me for my query. So let's just do a simple SQL query, and let's say delete from, my table name is team, where ID is equal to 2. If I run that, I didn't get any errors. And if I refresh my table, you can see that 2 does not exist anymore. Even if I sort this, the Auburn Tigers are gone. All right, so let's come back into our main entry point of our app, and let's try running this again now that we have that conditional to check for teams that are already in there. And I still have a breakpoint there, so let me get rid of that breakpoint. Let's continue running it. And you can see down here already that it has the insert statement right here for Auburn Tigers. So that's good. That just got committed. And then we got back to our breakpoint in our main controller because we haven't moved on to the games model yet. So, all right, so that ran, no errors. Let's go double check our database and make sure that, there we go, the Auburn Tigers made it back in. But we didn't get any errors because it didn't try to add all of these other teams that already existed. Perfect. So, the next step in our main controller is to get the games data using the games model. So just like with the teams model, we're no longer going to return this data back, and we no longer need to feed it in because we're going to save this games data into the database, and any teams data that we might need, we can get from the database. So I'm going to move my breakpoint down below this line, and then let's go take a look at the read in games data function in the games model. Now, for the sake of saving y'all from having to watch me type all of this out again, what I've done here is I have gone ahead and just copied and pasted the same function that I had for reading in the teams data. And then I went ahead and updated the name of the file, and I updated all my variables names and my class names to reflect game instead of teams. So all the logic here is the exact same thing that we did with the teams data, except now we're doing it for the games. And when we create our game object here that's going to get added to the database, we are reading in different data about that team. So that's the only difference right there. So let's run that and let's see if this works. So I'm going to come back to my main entry point. Let's debug it. All right, we made it to our breakpoint. I don't see any errors. That's good. Let's take a look at our database and see if our data made it in there. We know we have teams data, and look, now we have games data. Great. Looks like all our columns are coming through. Now the one thing we're missing is scores data. All right. And remember that the scores data came in with the game file. So inside of the game data that was inside of our JSON file, each game had score data associated with it. So let's take a look at the game model. And so we know that if we want to get these scores, we're going to have to add them in when we read in this game's data. So let's just put a breakpoint in here somewhere. We'll do it on our for loop. And let's run it and just use our debugger to get a view of what all data is inside of this game's data. I'm going to go ahead and step down so that we run this for loop, and now I should have something inside of my game's data variable. And I do. So if I look in here, I have information about the game. So for example, we're already pulling out the ID, we're pulling out the season and adding that to the game, the week. But I also have some information inside of this game data about the home team's ID and their name, their conference, their division, and their points. Okay. So when I'm I'm thinking about the scores that I need to pull out of here. And in my score model, if you remember, I have a game ID. All right, we know that from the game based off of game data ID. We have the team ID. Okay, so for the home team, their ID is going to be home ID. For the away team, their ID will be away ID. For the team side, I can hard code that to be home for the home team and away for the away team. And then for the points, For the home team, it'll be home underscore points, and for the away team, it'll be away underscore points. Okay? So now, to create these scores, we're going to do it in the same way that we created games, which is the same way that we created teams. And we're going to create an object based on that score, and then we will add it to our session before we commit our session. Okay? So down in here, right after I create that game object, let's go ahead and create a score object. All right, now I need the same fields, so game ID is equal to game data ID. My team ID, remember, is game underscore data home ID. Our team side, this time we are going to hard code to home. Since this is for the home team, this first score that we're creating. And then we need to know the points, which is going to be the game data home points. All right, so now we have a score for the home team. Let's go ahead and create one for the away team. And so instead of home ID, now we'll have away ID. Instead of home side, they will be the away side. And instead of home points, this will be away points. So now for each game record in that JSON file, we will add a game to our database, and we will add 2 scores to the database, one for our home team and one for our away team. So let's take these breakpoints out. I'm going to rerun my debugger, and let's see what comes out of it. So we got to our breakpoint back in the main controller after we read in the games. I don't see any errors here. That's good. And let's go take a look at our database. We have teams, we have games, and now if I look at scores, they're not there, but if I refresh, oh no, they're still not there. So, the reason why they're not there is because in our game model, if you remember, just like we did in teams, we're checking to see if the game is already there, and if the game already exists, then we're not running this code inside of the conditional. So in order to get all these scores in, we're going to have to get rid of these games. So the easiest way I can do this now is I can delete my database. Oh, remember, you have to stop your debugger. We'll delete the database, and then we'll rerun our code. And this is why I was telling y'all that it's pretty easy if you want to add a table later or add a new column later. By setting up your code to go ahead and create the database for you and import all that data in, it's very easy for us to start fresh by just deleting our current database and rerunning our code to create all that again. So if I go look at my database now, we have teams, we have games, and we have scores. And you'll notice for each game here, so this has the same game ID, I have 2 different teams, one for the home team, one for the away team, and they each have points. All right. So let's go back to our main controller, and let's bump down to the next step. Now what we need to do is we need to rank the teams from most to least. And we're going to do that again in our team model. Except our team model knows how to get teams from the database, so I don't need to pass in anything to this. And because we're using the model view control design pattern, I want all of my database calls to be made from inside of my models and not from my views or from my controller. And so to get data from my model to my view, I am going to bring something back and pass it through my controller to give it to my view, because I don't want to put any code inside of my views that have to deal with talking to the database. All of that should be inside of my model. So I'll run this function on the model to get my results back, and then I'll bring that to my view using a variable here inside of my controller. So let's go to the team model and look at the rank teams by PPG function. So here in my team model, I'm going to scroll down. Here's my old rank teams by PPG. It brought in teams, but we don't need that anymore because we're going to read it from the database. And so now we need to go get this from the database. And what we were doing before was we were using this sorted function. Remember, this teams variable was a dictionary, and so we were trying to sort this dictionary. But now that we've moved all this data out into the database, we're not going to need to sort it like a dictionary anymore. So I'm going to erase that, and let's write a query that will go get this data out of the database and calculate the points per game for us, the average points per game, and then go ahead and order it for us. All right. Now, I'll show you how to write this query with SQLAlchemy, but it can sometimes be helpful to kind of have an idea in your mind of how you would write this using SQL, because we're going to be using a lot of the same terminology and a lot of the same concepts as you would use if you're writing a SQL query. So if I were going to write this in SQL, I would know I need to select something. I usually start my queries with select star, and then I come back to it. We know we're going to need to get, really, let's start with what we want to get out of it. We know we're going to need to get the team names, because that's what we're going to need to pass to our view to print it out in that table. All right, and our team names, if you remember, come from the school. So I'm just going to say team.school. And we also need to get the average points per game. Now the average points, the points are inside of our score table. All right. So I'm going to use the score.points. And we're going to need to make sure that we pull these back for each school, and since we have a aggregate function here, the average, that should tell us that we're going to need to group by. We're going to need to group by the team to be able to calculate the average score points for each team. All right. So after our select, we do our from. We're going to get this from the team table. And because we're also going to be getting the scores, we're going to need to join to the score table. So let's join to score on, and how these connect together, if you remember, is through if I go to the score model, this is through the team ID on our score maps to the ID on our team. So my condition here on my join is team.id is equal to score.teamID. So now we have those joined. The next thing we need to do is we need to group by the teams. So we'll group by, and you could group by team.school, but whenever possible, I try to group by the primary key of a table, because it is possible that two schools might have the same name for some reason, but it shouldn't ever be possible for two teams to have the same ID, because those are both primary keys. All right, so let's group it by the team ID, and then we need to rank these from highest to lowest points per game, right? So let's do order by the average score points. And we want to go from most to least, so I'm going to say descending. Okay. Now, if you're running this in SQL, I think you would also need to have team.school out here. And so this is kind of what our SQL query would look like. We select something from a table, we join to another table, we group by, and then we order. All right, and we're using the average aggregate function to calculate our points per game. Okay, so we are going to kind of replicate this query, except we're going to use SQLAlchemy to help us build this. So if you remember how we queried before, we start with our session. So we're going to need a session like we had up here in this other function. So I'm just going to copy this code here. We'll open up our session. And then inside this session, we can use our session object, which we created right there. So session.query will allow us to query. Now inside of this query, if you remember before, we just put team, and this gave us back the whole team object. We can also just ask for one part of that team, one column, if we say team.id. Well, actually, we want to bring back, remember in our select, we want to bring back team.school. So this query function is we're going to define what we want to select and bring back. All right, so the first thing is team.school, and then we can do a comma, and we can get the average score dot points. All right, now you see a squiggly line underneath my average right here, and that's because right now Python doesn't know what AVG is. And so I went and Googled a little bit before and to try to figure out how to get the average inside of SQLAlchemy. I think I might have even talked to ChatGPT about it, which, by the way, ChatGPT, if you're using the free version, I think was last updated in 2021. So it's still on the older version of SQLAlchemy. So you might be a little safer sticking to Google. But if you need to, you can try to ask ChatGPT. But if you look for how to find the average, it'll tell you to import this func module from SQLAlchemy.sql, and then you can use that func.avg function will give us the average. All right, so we're selecting our team.school and our score.points. We're going to get it from team. Now, SQLAlchemy is smart enough to know that the first type of object that we're dealing with inside of our query is a team. So we don't actually have to explicitly tell it that we're coming from this team, because it knows that since we started with team right here, it's going to go ahead and assume that we're pulling from the team table. Next, what we need to do is we need to join on our score. So I'll come to the very end of my .query function, and I can say .join score. And then I need to group by, so I can say group by. I need to pass in what I want to group by, and here we're going to say team.id, because I'm going to use the primary key to make sure that I always have unique IDs there. Now we've grouped by, and so now we need to order by. So I'll do .order by. And remember, we're going to order by the average score points. So I'm going to copy my function here for the average. Put that inside of my order by. And then right after that .average function, I can apply a .desc function, open close parentheses. for descending order. So, might look a little wild, but here we have written out this whole query using SQLAlchemy. So this is what it would look like in SQL. And then in SQLAlchemy, we just tell it we want to query the team.school and the average score points. We'll need to join to the score table. We then want to group by the team ID, and we want to order by the average points in descending order. All right. So I'm going to just comment that out so it won't make a problem for us. And then let's put a breakpoint here and see what this is going to return us. Now, I almost forgot at the end here, you remember when we queried before, I told you you can use the dot first or you can do dot all. So I'm going to pull back all of these because I want to get all of them. And because we are not making any updates, we're not inserting or updating or deleting anything, we don't have to commit our session. For just a simple query like this, we can just use .all to get them all back. And so let's go ahead and run this and see what our data looks like coming out of that. All right, I'm going to clear my watch and I'm going to look at what this variable is. Add that to my watch. All right, so you'll see here it's a list. And it looks like I have a list of tuples. All right, with the team name, the school, and their average. All right. It's not rounded right now, so when we get to our view, we might need to go ahead and round this so that it's prettier to print out. But you see, we just have a list of tuples. All right. So we can return that list of tuples. I'm going to remove my breakpoint. This is going to return it back into our main controller. If we return it from this function, then we can assign it to this variable. And then we can pass this variable into our printer view to print these out. So let's go take a look now at this function inside of our view. So if I go back to my files, go to my views and go to my printer view. Let's look at what we have here. So we pass in our variable here. Now, if you remember before, what we were dealing with when we passed these in was a list of objects. We're not dealing with a list of objects anymore. We have a list of tuples. So we have two things inside of this. This is the first place it gets used, and we have it in a for loop. So I can go ahead and pull those two things out. Remember, the first was the team school, and the second was the points per game average. All right. Before, we said the points per game, we took that out of the object that got passed in, but now we have that coming in with this variable that we passed in. So I can remove this line. That takes care of that. We have team object dot school is now just team school. And I have no more squigglies. Now, the one thing that we might want to do that I mentioned before is, remember, these were not rounded. So when we print this out to our table, remember, first we print out the rank, then we print out the points per game, then we print out the team school. So let's go ahead and round this. So I'm going to use my round function. Let's round it to 2 decimals like we did before, and I'll close that. All right, let me save my printer view. Let me go back to my main app entry point. And let's run this and see how it goes. All right, we got our table that looks familiar. And if I scroll up to the top, We have North Central, and then Incarnate World. This looks to be the same order that we had before. So, there we have it. We have now changed up our code so that we are reading and writing from the database. We have a table for our team, table for our game, and a table for our scores. And then we have updated our controller and our models and our view to work with that new type of data. If I bring over my GitHub desktop view, you'll notice that it has all of our file changes in here. But it has one thing that I don't want, and it has my database file in here. And typically database files, especially because this is data that we can recreate, I don't want to push up to GitHub. And maybe this is data that is sensitive to you or your client. So let's use a trick that I showed in the very first video, and let's add this SQLite file to our gitignore file so that we don't end up pushing that up to GitHub. So if I come into my main code, I have a file down here already for gitignore. I already have it ignoring any PYC files. You may notice in any of the packages I created, for example, my models package, it created a folder called PyCache that has a bunch of PYC files in it. And these PYC files are just compiled versions of our code. And they get created when we run this code that's inside of a package, but we don't need those PYC files. So that's why I didn't add them. I don't want them to go up to GitHub. And I also don't want, I'm going to use a wildcard here, any .SQLite files to make it into GitHub. So if I save this in my gitignore and bring my GitHub desktop back, you'll notice that it recognized the change in my gitignore, and it now does not list that SQLite database in here. All right. Now you could also optionally just uncheck something if you don't want to push it up, but the gitignore file is a safer case because now anytime that star.SQLite is in our gitignore, we know that we're never going to accidentally push that up there. All right, so we have that. Let's add a comment. I'll go ahead and commit to my local branch, and I'll push this up to GitHub. Now I want to show y'all one other thing. So I'm going to check out another branch that I made to set this up. And this is a way, I'm going to close all these out. This is a way that if you want to use a different method to create your database and get all of your data into your database, such as maybe the way that Professor Derzgincy showed in his video, we can still use SQLAlchemy to interact with our database and do the querying without necessarily creating all of those model classes that I had before that I showed you. So what I've done here in the code is I have created in my models package, I have a model here for database model.py. And I got rid of my teams model, my games model, and my score model, and the base model. And I just I'm kind of putting everything into this one DB model. I have in here, I have copied my functions from my teams model. I didn't edit it at all. I just copied the read-in teams data function that we just worked on, and I copied in the rank teams by PPG function that we worked on before. And then I also, from my games model, I just copied in the games data, read in games data function. You see we're still creating a game object and two score objects. So we're still going to be interacting with the database in the same way we did before. My query here still looks the same inside where we're getting the ranked teams. So all of this is the same, but the real difference here is I don't have those complicated models anymore for my team and my game and my score to tell SQLAlchemy how to create that database for me. And instead, I have a database here that is already pre-built. I've already built it, and I've already put all of my data inside of here. So instead of having SQLAlchemy build this database for me, I'm just going to have it read what's already there, and then I can use SQLAlchemy to interact with it the same way I have before. So I've made a change to my create database function, and you'll notice that just like before, we still create our engine, and I still have a global engine variable. But now I'm going to use some code that I got from the SQLAlchemy website, and this is something called auto mapping. And you might also look up auto mapping and reflection. And if you want to pause, you can copy this link right here, and this will take you to a good document on it on the SQLAlchemy website. But using these two lines of code, I'm creating my base class, automap base, using this automap base function, and then I'm preparing it. I pass in my function, I tell it to reflect equals true, and what this is going to do is this is going to go in and read my database file and create all the classes that I need for my team, my game, and my score class. So instead of me defining these classes, it's going to go into the database and create these classes for me based on what it sees there. Now, I want these to be global variables, so I did just like I did with my engine, and I defined them above globally, so they're outside the scope of my function, and then I use this global keyword here to be able to access those global variables. And if I run this, let's go ahead and run it from the app entry point. I'll debug it so we get to our breakpoint right there. If I look at my base variable, I'm going to add it to my watch. It has a property inside called classes, and this is where it builds the classes. And so I'm going to use base.classes.team for my team class. For my game class, I'm going to make it be base.classes.game, and my score will be base.classes.score. So anywhere in these other functions that I was previously referring to my class, I now have these global variables that have my classes mapped to them. And again, we got these classes by telling SQLAlchemy to go auto map whatever was already in this database file. So I got rid of quite a few of my models, but my view has changed. My view has stayed the same. My controller has stayed the same. And I moved a lot of my functions from my other models into this model. And so now, if I go run this code, let's just make sure that it runs. And there it is. Here's our table that we've been looking at before. And again, the real difference here is I didn't manually define each of the classes for the team, the game, and the score. I let SQLAlchemy go look at that database and create those classes for me. Now, to do it this way, you're going to have to find another way using Python to create your database file and to put that data in there. But if you find the other way of doing that easier than using SQLAlchemy to create those classes, then this is an option that you might consider. I hope this has been helpful. Of course, if you run into any questions on this particular project or even on your own projects, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Professor Derzinski. We'll be happy to help you through this. And in the office hours upcoming, we will be happy to help you kind of look at your projects, and think about how you want to try to create your databases and read in your data. I hope you all have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.